Welcome back to Broncos and Parts Garage. My name's Chris. If you're new to the channel, please stick around to the end. You'll see additional links for content we've already created. Next to me, I've got my 1996 Ford Bronco. About 2 weeks ago, I was driving, hit some train tracks. I heard a snap, crackle, and a pop. By the time I got to the store, I had taken a picture of it, posted it online next to a 2021 Bronco, and people started commenting on why my truck was sagging in the front. It turns out it's not a torn spring bucket, but I actually broke a spring. So today's video, we're gonna remove this spring, reinstall a used spring, put it all back together. Coming up in the spring, no pun intended, we're gonna be putting in a lift kit. So let me grab some tools and we'll get started. The first step, you wanna make sure that your truck's on a level surface. If not, you wanna chalk the rear tires. That way when you raise up the front end of the vehicle, you don't have to worry about it shifting or rolling backwards. The next step will be placing the jack underneath the passenger side or the side where your spring's broken, the TTB axle, and we're gonna raise this up. We were able to get this tire about 8 or 9 inches off the ground.
Next up, we're going to put the jack stand underneath the body of the truck, supporting it only by the frame, not by the radius arms.
And that will allow the suspension to droop down, correct?
Correct. Just like that.
The next step will be lowering this jack, putting the weight of the vehicle on that jack stand, which is underneath that frame rail. This will allow this suspension to droop down naturally, allowing us to gain access to the spring. The next step will be removing the wheel from the vehicle.
All right, so we're going to start with removing the rear shock. It's going to be wrench on the back side, socket on the front. Sometimes it doesn't want to come back out. Like that. And then for the front shock on this truck, we're going to remove the nut on the top of the spring bucket to unbolt the upper stud.
And that came off surprisingly easy for a Michigan truck.
All right, so the next step, we're going to unbolt the upper sway bar mounts. You've got 4 nuts total, 2 on each side.
It's also a good time to check your sway bar bushings, make sure they're not dry rotted or tore out bad.
And we're just gonna let that hang down.
The next step will be lowering down the axle so we can remove this busted spring. So let's do that right now. And that's good. We can just spin off the bottom piece like this and set it aside. You can see where it freshly broke. And uncoil the top out of this retainer bracket, which we'll remove in a few minutes. Next, we'll get a 1 1/8 inch socket and remove this lower spring retainer. So let's get that done now. And remove the rest of the coil spring. Next, we're going to remove the upper retaining bracket. It's going to use a 13mm socket. We're going to set this aside. So here's the new coil spring that's going in. To make sure you put these in properly, you always want to remember that the coiled up portion would go on the bottom and the straighter piece would mount on the top underneath that bracket we just removed. So I'm going to set these in now. It's gonna sit right there for a second. The next thing you're gonna wanna do is take the wash that we previously removed, use your fingers and kind of place it back on the stud, and then finger thread the bolt in place. Put that there. I don't know if my meat hook fingers will work. Okay, I've got it started, and I'm finger tightening it as tight as I can go down to that washer to hold it in place. There we go. The next step will be lining up the top of your spring to the top of the perch, and at the same time lining up the front shock to go back into the spring bucket hole. So you want to do this simultaneously while you have someone slowly jack up the vehicle. So go ahead and start raising that up. So okay, keep raising it up.
Now you're going to want to tap it again to make sure it seats all the way. So tap it straight in at the top. There you go.
Beautiful. All right.
And keep going.
Keep going.
And you want to raise it until the shock stud is most of the way into the bushing.
We've got everything started. Now we're going to put the nut on the top of the shock, and we're going to reattach the upper retaining bracket for the coil spring. The next step will be reinstalling your upper spring retaining bracket. Now, when we took this one out, the upper hole in the spring bucket got stripped out. So what we're going to do is replace that with a nut, bolt, and washer. But to get this in, you want to make sure you line up these two indents in the bracket with the indents that are in the top of your spring bucket. So you'll start by pushing it down, looping it back around, and making sure that you get those indents lined up with your spring bucket. Next thing we're going to do is place a new nut through the hole. I'm going to use a washer on the back side and a lock washer, and we will tighten this up by hand, and then we'll wrench it tight off camera.
All right, so the next step we're going to do is to tighten up the lower spring retaining nut. So like I was talking about earlier in the video, you're going to have to fish your sockets and extensions down. So we're going to drop the socket in first, and we're going to reach in and put the socket on the nut. We're going to grab a long extension and fish that down in next. Get it connected in. Can be a little difficult. And we're going to put one more extension in from the top. Just like that. Now, if you don't have a compact impact wrench or an air ratchet to fit in here, because there's not a lot of space, you can do it manually with a wrench or a ratchet. But in our case, I have an impact that'll fit, so I'm going to use that. And unfortunately, I have to lower the jack down a little bit for this to fit. I'm going to lower it down just a little bit so I can get my impact in there. Just like that. And we're going to tighten it up. Once that's done, we're going to have to pull out this extension, break it apart as we go. And this part can be really difficult. Sometimes you need another set of hands.
Or a long magnetic tool. The next step will be securing the nut on top of the forward shock mount. So go ahead and start raising the axle up. And that's good, right there. Once the spring starts compressing, you know you've got that up far enough. Put that on by hand. And we're gonna use an 18mm wrench to hold the bottom of the shock mount, and then tighten up the top bolt. What's that? Is it? The next step will be bolting up the rear shock mount. We'll take the bolt that we removed earlier, slide it through the bracket and the shock mount itself. We'll finger tighten the bolt on the back. We'll grab some tools and tighten that up and secure it. And that's that step. The next step will be reattaching your sway bar. Now, we happen to have the axle raised to the perfect height to line this up, but sometimes you may have to play with the height of the axle to make sure that you can line up the brackets with the mounts on the frame. So we're gonna grab this, secure it in place. I'm gonna hand thread on one of these nuts to hold it in place, and I'll start the other one. Take our 15 millimeter and tighten these up. And we're going to do a little on each side to keep it even. And now we're going to repeat this process on the other side. We're nearing the end of the project. The next step will be putting the wheel and tire back on the truck, so let's get that done now. Okay, you want to remember when you're tightening up your lug nuts, you want to do it in a star pattern. You never want to go completely in a circle.
So we'll start at the top, move it to the other side, move the other side. So, a little bit more.
Now, later on, we'll hit these with a torque wrench and put them to the manufacturer's specifications. The final step will be raising the vehicle back up via the suspension. That way we can get it high enough to remove the jack stand. Then we'll lower the vehicle back down onto the new spring. Thanks for sticking around this long in the video. This is a pretty personal project for me. This is my daily driver, 1996 Bronco. The spring on the passenger side was busted. We found out during this fix that the driver's side spring was busted as well. We fixed that off camera. There are a few tips and tricks you can do. It is a little bit easier when we are able to grab the spring and pull it out. Jesse, what do you think about that?
Yeah, when you're going to have to do this at home and you don't have a busted spring, it's just a worn out one, you do have to do that little trick where you feed the socket and the extensions down, and it can be a little annoying. So we didn't have to do it in this case, but generally the process is the same regardless of whether you have to do that or not.
Yeah, make sure that you clean up a lot of those nuts and bolts before you remove them. We did have the opportunity to put some penetrating oil on them to ease the removal and installation. We did have a little problem stripping out the top spring bracket, which we just put a nut and bolt through. Coming up in the future, we're going to be actually removing this suspension and putting in a 6-inch lift kit. In the comment section below, do us a favor. Let us know if you're Team Milwaukee
Or Team DeWalt.
We'll see you next time.